Hello and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick, and as you can tell by the surroundings, we're in a very special place today. We're going to discuss the history of St. John's Episcopal Church, which is very, very closely tied and essentially the same history as the city of Hampton. My guest today is Jim Tormey. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
Actually, you should be welcoming me because I'm in your setting today.
We're glad to have you here.
Well, thank you, and thank you for sharing. And I know the history of this, I feel like I should whisper because I'm in a church. This is very different.
Please don't.
Okay. Is just an amazing building. And if you would, I know your history goes back well before this building, but if you could just start and tell us a little bit about the church that exists today and some of the very special features and architecture of it.
This building dates from 1728. At that time, the colonists established Hampton as a town sufficiently to want to have the church here. Previously, it had been located out Pembroke Avenue, about a mile, so that was quite a distance to walk or ride to get to church.
So 1728, the city's laid out. We have King Street and Queen Street, and the church sits right prominently in the downtown.
It does. They commissioned Henry Carey, who had built the Wren buildings in Williamsburg, to build this church. The brick for the church was excavated from the site. The bricks are made here. They're made in a Flemish bond, which makes some people think that perhaps they were shipped from England, but not so. They're from here. The walls were 2 feet thick, and that's why you have this original building still standing. If not, it would have come down in the fire of the Civil War.
Right.
The building was laid out in the form of a cross. The longest dimension is 75 feet, and then it's 60 feet across the transepts. The aisles are 20 feet wide on either side. When originally built, this building would have had box pews.
Right, like some of the ones you see at Bruton Parish now, right?
Similar to the ones you see at Bruton Parish today. You would not have had in that original church the stained glass windows, which you see here.
They were clear glass then.
They were clear glass, and it did not have an arched roof such as we have. They had a flat roof, but they did have 3 galleries, whereas we only have 2. Third gallery would be on the water side, the south side, and it was there that African Americans would have sat during the services. The red tiles that you see on the floor are similar to the tiles that we had in earlier churches from tile that was made here on the site. The church was paid for by the people of the community. Everybody was a member of this church, whether
because
they
had
liked
to be.
it or not.
That's
they had
right.
to be a member.
That's right.
The church tax was probably the largest tax that they paid. That tax supported the minister. It paid for the upkeep of the building and any additions or whatever that might be made to the building. And it also took care of the poor. So if you had a person who was ill, he'd be cared for by the church, and the charges would be distributed amongst the community.
Well, you know, that was such an interesting point when I was looking through your book, because it suggested that the church really was a form of state back in the day. I mean, you had to be a member, you had to pay the tax, but the tax went to things that in this day and age, to some extent, government provides. It was sort of the first public-private partnership.
It was a safety net.
Right, right, and you got the taxes, sort of a grant to compensate for that. So tell us then, in the day when this church was first built, colonists had to be a member of the Church of England and had to attend a certain number of days a year. What would it have been like here on a Sunday? How do people get here? What is a service like?
Well, let me go back a bit. In the 1690s, there was an act of religious toleration had been passed. So a person at that time didn't have to come here. He could go to another church, but he still had to pay taxes for here. And he had to go to another church. He couldn't get out of church.
Church attendance was
Church attendance
mandatory.
was required, yes. They came, many of them, by water, because that was the easy way to come. And in fact, that door, the south door to the church, is called the water door.
So people would come across, come via the Hampton River and then leave their boats and
Yes.
walk the couple blocks up here.
And then, of course, the main roads that came out of town that went to the Back River area, the Yorktown roads, the roads to Warwick County, all brought people here.
So in the day, this parish was quite large. In fact, when St. John's was first established, way back in 1610, it was what is now Hampton, most of what is now Newport News, and some surrounding area.
Yes, the parish covered the entire county. In fact, the name of this parish is still Elizabeth City Parish.
It is,
That goes
okay.
back to the original name.
Date to the original Anglican. And, but you say it was informally known as the Kecoughtan Parish.
Yes.
So let's go back to those first days. Let's go back to 1610 and tell us what St. John's was like then.
Well, in 1610, the community was, of course, very small, maybe 25 people. John Rolfe mentions it in his report that he sent to the king in 1616. He said there were 10 farmers, and of course the rest would be soldiers and builders. But they brought their minister with them from Jamestown. His name was William Mays.
And that shows how important the church was, that
Yes,
when
indeed.
you have only soldiers and farmers, basically what you need for economic and safety, you still need that spiritual, that was considered that important.
Absolutely. In 1622, there was an Indian uprising, which resulted in the deaths of 347 colonists. And while Kecoughtan was not attacked, the people drew in across the east side of the river to be farther away from the Indian threat. That was the site of the second church, which we know and today is located on the campus of Hampton University.
The site of the first church has not been
We don't-
exactly, but it's somewhere around Chesapeake and LaSalle, like right along the water, right?
That is correct.
Okay.
And near a small stream called Church Creek. 1623, the second site was adapted in, it was a plain wooden church. And people probably came on Sunday really as much for social reasons as any other, because it was a respite from the very difficult lives that they led.
And back then there wasn't much town. Most people were farmers, lived far apart on a decent sized plot of land, right?
They were engaged in tobacco growth at that time primarily. The pattern of agriculture tended to shift with time. In the 1660s, there was a great hurricane. There was a flood stage of 12 feet, which if it occurred today would put a good deal of Hampton underwater.
Yeah.
That caused them to rebuild, and they rebuilt on the west side, where the population was tending to shift anyway.
That's probably also, though, that hurricane pushed them way inland.
The hurricane pushed them inland, and that church was used until, as we said before, in the 1720s, they felt that it was more appropriate to be here closer to the town. It was also a wooden church, very modest, about 25 by 50 feet. Probably a rather uncomfortable place. This was considered a luxurious church in its time.
Oh, I bet, compared to especially some of the earlier ones. Now, didn't you also say in the early days that people with weapons, with swords, were ordered or expected to bring them to church? I mean, it was not a safe, you didn't have safe passage to and from
It was an act
church
of
at
the
all.
General Assembly that all persons who were armed with muskets or carried swords would bring them to church.
Because of the danger of traveling through lands shared from, taken from, whatever your perspective is, the Indians at the time.
That's right. They had to be ready for anything because the nature of the uprisings was that they were very sudden. They were surprises.
So this church, which is gorgeous, palatial by the standards, and still, a beautiful and fairly large church, is then built in what time?
1728.
Okay.
1728, yes. Now, at the time that it was built, they wanted to have a steeple. In 1760, they were able to afford a steeple. That was at the west end of the church, and that stood for about a century. And then when the church was destroyed by fire in the Civil War, the steeple came down. It was never rebuilt. But a tower was built that houses the dressing rooms for choirs and vesting rooms for the clergy.
So now let's go backward though. So you were in the colonial period and you're thriving because there's a tax and you are essentially supported by the state. What happens after the Revolutionary War?
After the Revolution, the church has hard times. There was repugnance for anything English. They did not want to pay the taxes. People never have wanted to be taxed.
Right.
So the church fell into disrepair. They were not able to afford a minister for a number of years. This extended through the War of 1812 when Hampton was attacked by the British, occupied. This churchyard was used as a slaughterhouse for their animals. Pews were stripped from the building. The roof had fallen in. The steeple was in bad repair.
So it was already in bad shape, and then the British come and occupy and pillaged
make it worse.
Quite a bit.
That's
yes.
right.
Pillaged all of Hampton,
Yes.
but including St. John's.
Yes. Then in the 1820s, a very forthright woman by the name of Jane Barron Hope was
Barron
here.
is a name we know, and Hope actually too, Hope Street.
Yes. Was visiting the graveyard with a cousin, John's servant, and she turned to him and said, if I were a man, cousin, I would build up these walls. And he wrote later that he was energized by her words, and he went immediately to Norfolk to seek funds from friends and relatives. And they reestablished the church, and it was rebuilt by the 1820s. I think it was reconsecrated in 1828.
So then it had a pretty decent, thriving period again.
It did indeed, up until the Civil War.
The Civil War.
Yes.
And tell us what happened. I mean, I've seen is it a photograph or a drawing that is so famous where you can see almost nothing in downtown Hampton but the walls of St. John's and a few chimneys?
There are both photographs and
Okay.
drawings of that. Very stark time, and only bricks remained.
And the Confederates retreating burned, I mean, it said some of them burned their own homes, started the fires in their own homes, divided the city up into quadrants and set fire to everything on their way out.
Yes, it was done to deny the use of the town to the Union, which had temporarily withdrawn its men away from Hampton. They had occupied Hampton. Then after the First Manassas, they had to send some of their troops north, so they pulled back out of Hampton. At that time, General Magruder, the commander of the Confederate forces, sent Captain Phillips to Hampton. They determined that they were going to burn the town. They quartered their horses here at the church walls. They went to the intersection of King and Queen Street. And they spread out in the 4 quadrants and burned the town, including the church.
Why did the walls survive? I mean, that is just the most amazing picture when you see, well, certainly there weren't that many brick structures. I mean, that's why there's fireplaces in homes that survive, but not the entire home. But
well, the walls survived here because they were so thick.
how thick are they, Jim?
They're 2 feet thick.
Wow.
The length of 2.5 bricks.
And originally that was for withstanding attack, or just for withstanding attack from Indians, withstanding hurricanes, withstanding, who knew that?
I think that's the way you
fires.
built churches in those days, if you had the
If you had the means.
to do so.
So then after the Civil War, it took a while for the church to be rebuilt.
Yes, once again, there was a rebuilding period. Church services were held in a meeting house that was near the courthouse. And in 1669, the retired chaplain at Fort Monroe came to be the minister. And at that point, many of the families who had lived here had returned, and the church was resumed and healthy again.
Well, it is amazing, and St. John's is one of Hampton's firsts, and in fact, one of our most important firsts. It was the is the oldest continuous parish, Anglican parish,
Yes,
in the United States.
yes.
Um,
And we're real pleased that the church is so close to the History Museum, and when the school children visit the History Museum as a part of their instruction, that they're able to come over here to St. John's and see this building and hear about it.
I know I certainly brought my Cub Scouts here when we were learning about the history of Hampton. We would do the museum and the graveyard and then sometimes the church. Tell us a little bit about the churchyard, because you have a number of notables buried out there and graves that date back to this building.
1701 is the earliest grave. Of course, that predates the
building.
But that was a grave of Willis Wilson, who was the property owner here earlier. The church started with an acre and a half. The graveyard grew in increments as it required more space, and that was important to the town too, because it was a town cemetery, and people of all faiths are buried here, including ministers of other faiths. Today there are probably 3,000 graves here, and the 6 acres were acquired bit by bit as they needed more space.
Okay, so tell us just a little bit about the church today. It is still an active parish. You have services here every Sunday.
Yes, we have a congregation of approximately 500 people, and we have a very fine organ, which
they didn't have in the earliest days.
We did not have in the earliest days, of course. That organ dates from the 1970s, when it was decided to have an organ in keeping with the architecture of the old church.
And the stained glass is a little bit newer as well.
The stained glass has been donated over the years. Much of it was made from the Willett Studio in Philadelphia, and is donated by people from time to time. One particularly interesting window, well, we have many interesting windows, but one that's interesting is one that depicts the baptism of Pocahontas. We have another which is dedicated to the colonial clergy, because there were, of course, colonial clergymen from 1610 until 1776. All of those clergymen had to go to England in order to be ordained, because there were no bishops in America. We have the names of every one of those men in that window. It's one of the rarest windows we have.
Oh, that's wonderful. And your silver, your communion silver, also has an amazing story, actually.
Yes, the communion silver was made in 1618 and was a gift of a Mrs. Mary Robinson of London to the people of Virginia. It was located at Smith's Hundred, which was further upstream toward Jamestown, and that community was wiped out in the Indian Uprising. And so it was decided to give the silver here, where there was the largest parish in Virginia. How it has managed to survive through all these years, I don't know.
All the wars and the
where
pillaging.
It was during the wars and the
fires.
difficult periods.
That's quite amazing. And they still don't know who hit it during actually either period.
We do not know who hit it, but they hit it well, because it's still in use on special occasions.
All right, Jim, so if someone wants to come see the church, obviously they can attend a Sunday service. You have 2 every Sunday, but you also have certain open hours, or people could call for a tour. Is that
Yes,
accurate?
They can call on any weekday, and generally they can come on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to visit.
And the cemetery gates are open during daytime hours?
The cemetery gates are open, and visitors are welcome.
It's an amazing and peaceful place to walk. Occasionally when I'm going from one building to the other downtown, I'll cut through and just take a moment, to relax and take in that history. Because here you are sort of in this bustling downtown, and there is this very integral part of our history that dates back to such a different day, but is in active use still, and
Yes.
that tradition carries on with people like you and the other parishioners here.
Well, it's particularly welcoming. It seems to me the time that the crepe myrtle is in blossom, and during the various seasons we have flowering trees.
Well, it's a beautiful and special place, Jim, and I thank you for letting us come and bring it to people on TV so they get a chance to see it as well. And I hope they'll come see it in person.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you for watching this episode of Round Robin.